Hello all, welcome to the lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to talk about the Cold War era. This chapter is from the book Contemporary World Politics, and today we are going to consider the first chapter, that is the Cold War era. As the name suggests, and when I see this term, the Cold War era, basically what we are going to talk about is the period of Cold War, the era of Cold War altogether. So let's start with the lecture. So firstly, let us now understand what this Cold War is all about. What is this Cold War and why we call it a Cold War? Firstly, let us understand that Cold War was a period of war between two nations, that was America on one side and USSR, that is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union on the other side. Just Soviet Union, when we talk about the Soviet Union, it was actually a particular region of about 15 republics who have joined together to form one Soviet Union, that is known as USSR. On the other hand, it was America. So if I look at Cold War, as the name suggests, why is this term called as cold and not a hot war? The reason to this question is that why is it not called a hot war is because after the Second World War ended, there was a period that started from of the 1945. The period of Cold War started, and this period was known as Cold War and not as hot war because America and USSR never went to for a full-fledged war. Rather, there were a lot of conflicts and tensions between the two, but the two never went on for a full hot war. So this is the basic reason you will find that why it is known as a Cold War and why it is not called as a hot war. Now, secondly, coming to another very important fact, and the fact is that Cold War was said to be a war of ideologies. So why was Cold War a war of ideologies? This forms a very important question of this topic. Firstly, if I look at America and I look at USSR, what major difference do I found in these two states? Firstly, America was a capitalist state where the major principle of capitalism was followed. On the other hand, when I talk about USSR, I am more focused on communism, or I could say communism and socialism. So if I look at capitalism, what is capitalistic society and what is this communism all about? Firstly, understand that America or the capitalist model society always focused on profit making. That profit is really very important part, right? So the major focus was always on profit. On the other hand, if I talk about communism where everything was state centered, where everything was under the control of the state. So can you find a big difference over here? So capitalist societies, when I'm talking about profit making. I'm talking about a market oriented structure where the free forces of demand and supply work, and we have seen how powerful dollar is. On the other hand, when I talk about USSR, where everything was under the state, people had lack of freedom. So the freedom was not that much there. So this is the major reason that Cold War was known as the War of Ideologies. Now let's move forward. If you could look at the map, the period of Cold War started from 1945 and it is said to be concluded by 1989. This period of conflicts and tensions divided the whole globe into two halves. On the one hand, there was America with a capitalistic society, and on the other hand, it was USSR, as you can see from here. Now, one more important thing over here is, if I look at the map clearly, you could see a lot of things here. Warsaw Pact, communist allies of the USSR, other allies of the USSR, NATO, and then other allies of the USA, an allied state, and Cold War hotspots. So you can locate all these here. And as we move with the lecture forward, we are going to cover up all of the topic. Now, firstly, if you look at the USSR was a big nation, right? Since 15 republics together joined this, it was called as USSR. And as America was another major superpower, both of them wanted to become a superpower in the world. So this competition, this fight was all about to become a major superpower. In terms of a lot of factors, let us consider economic, political, and military wise, USA always had an upper hand above USSR, and that was a basic challenge for USSR. That's why a war of ideology started after the end of the Second World War. So what was the Cold War? It was a period of intense hostility between US and USSR that stopped just short of actual war. That is why, as we have discussed, it was not called as a hot war altogether. Rather, it was considered to be just a Cold War. So this period of intense hostility here, very important. First question what we have covered is, why was it called a Cold War and not a hot war? Second important question over here is that why is Cold War a war of ideologies? So you should know all these questions when you're preparing this chapter. Secondly, this war of ideologies, you should be able to easily differentiate between the two ideologies of communism and capitalism. Thirdly, and the major focus area over here would be that the consequences or what factors led to the development of these Cold War. So what factors led to the development of Cold War? So as we have been discussing about the factors, and let us just elaborate a little more. If we look at the war of ideology started just after the end of the Second World War. We know what happened after the Second World War was the bomb blast, that is, was a nuclear bomb attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this war wasn't a war. It started with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, everything over here, if you have to understand, we have to understand to the factors, and everything goes back to a very important topic that we need to cover is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, firstly, now we have understood what a Cold War is, why it is called a war of ideologies, why it is said to be a Cold War and not a hot war. And now we focus on the factors that led to the development of this Cold War. So the direct confrontations between America and USSR, which were actually at a point of time were allies with each other in the Second World War, became enemies. What led to this direct confrontation? Let us understand and go back to the time period of 1962. As you can see from the map here, there is a place called Cuba and an island state over here. And you can see that how much in close proximity is this place to America. But do you know, this Cuba was actually an ally of USSR, and it used to receive lot of financial, economic, as well as lot of military aid from USSR, and thereby it was more close to USSR. But geographical location, if you look at it's of Cuba, was more near to America. It was at a point of time when at that time the leaders of USSR decided to make Cuba as a military base and use it as a military base, and thereby USSR decided to put over make it as a military base and put over nuclear missiles on this region. America, when got to know this, that nuclear missiles are being placed in a very close proximity to its geography, it started to take action, and this what led to the starting of the tensions known as Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union and received diplomatic and financial aid from it. So in April 1961, leaders of the USSR were worried that the USA would invade communist-ruled Cuba and overthrow its president Fidel Castro. Very important thing over here when we are discussing about the US, USSR and Cuba, you should know about the leaders. The leader of Cuba at that moment was President Fidel Castro. On the other hand, in 1962, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba for converting it into a Russian base. So can you see it started in 1961 and in 1962 when Nikita Khrushchev placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Just think for a while that if I take about India and the nations that are close to India, and if somebody starts placing nuclear missiles in any of the states, for instance Sri Lanka or any other neighboring state, say Bangladesh, it would be a worrisome for India. And the same way happened with America. 3 weeks later, Americans became aware of it, and the US President John F. Kennedy, so he is John F. Kennedy over here, and its advisors tried to find a solution to avoid full-scale nuclear war, because what happened in Japan, nobody around the world wanted to happen. But they were determined to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba. Kennedy ordered, at that moment, American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR. And this clash that started between USA and USSR came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this Cuban Missile Crisis literally raised the eyebrows of a lot of people around the world, because people were really scared now, because a nuclear war is never in benefit for any of the people around the globe. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a high point which came to be known as the Cold War. So now you understood that why Cold War is known as the war of ideologies and how it started with. So whenever you're talking about Cold War, a very important question over here is that the birth of Cold War started with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it refers to competition, the tensions and series of confrontations between USA and Soviet Union. We'll continue with the lecture in the next video. Stay tuned.